Our next discussion will focus on the future of U.S.-China relations. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the Honorable Kurt Campbell, Deputy Secretary of State, in conversation with Evan Feigenbaum, Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have 30 tight minutes with Kurt Campbell. So I suggest we get right into it. Kurt is the Deputy Secretary of State, guru on all things Indo-Pacific to many of us, and a good friend to many of us of many years. I saw on the program you were supposed to be doing this with Graham Allison. If, like Kurt and I, you've known Graham for 30 years, you will know that I am not Graham Allison. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment. And Kurt, thanks for carving out some time from a busy schedule for this. I thought we might start with the region before we drill down on the U.S.-China relationship a little bit. We both know Rich Armitage for many years. Rich famously, there's this aphorism attributed to Rich Armitage that if you want to get China right, you need to get the regional context right. And there's been a flurry of diplomacy, particularly on the defense side. I've noticed Secretary Austin was with the Japanese, Australians, and Filipinos the other day. Give us a sense of where you think we are on the regional context, both in shaping deterrence, but also in shaping incentives and disincentives for China.
So first, Evan, it's a pleasure to be with you here today, and I want to just acknowledge what an honor it is to be able to do this in memory of our dear friend, wonderful colleague, Ash Carter. It's daunting. It's an honor to be able to do this in his memory. I appreciate, Evan, the question more generally. I think when President Biden came to office, I think there was a recognition that the dominant regional focus of the United States would increasingly involve engagements in the Indo-Pacific. And I think we reviewed what we had seen over the last several years with respect to Chinese policy in the region, more generally with respect to economic and technology policy. And I think after some deep study and reflection, interaction with colleagues, what we sought to do, Evan, was put in place a multilateral, sort of multifaceted strategy. And I think the first part of that was really investment at home. If you look back carefully at what Xi Jinping said when first coming to power in 2012, 2013, 2014, huge focus on the elements of national power residing squarely in the arena of technology. So you've seen the United States invest substantially in technology capabilities, which we believe will be essential to claim the high ground with respect to global competition, global positioning. You see a series of investments in every critical element of technology going forward. And I think the second component of the strategy, Evan, involved, as you suggested, working with allies and partners. I think it'd be fair to say that we believe that our greatest advantage is our strong allies and partners, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but Europe. When we tried this idea of focusing more on the Indo-Pacific in the past, I think, unfortunately, we occasionally sent the message that we were somehow pivoting away from Europe. I think what we've tried to do in this iteration is to make clear that everything of purpose that the United States has ever done on the global stage, we've done with Europe. So a huge amount of focus now of working with partners in Europe on the Indo-Pacific together. We are working together on the Indo-Pacific. And then, as you suggested, a series of initiatives over a few years, an ASEAN summit, special ASEAN summit in Washington, deep engagement with Pacific Island nations seeking to step up our game in climate change and investments in technology, sea line cables for communication, a variety of things on illegal fishing. Huge amount of focus, as you indicate, on our dominant allies and partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and working not just bilaterally, but linking these countries together in new and innovative ways. The Quad, AUKUS, the issues that we've taken trilateral between the United States, Japan, and South Korea, and most recently the United States, Japan, and the Philippines. And then just lastly, recognizing that as we've sought to deepen our partnerships with these countries, at the core of our value proposition really is closer cooperation in technology. And so if you look at two relationships in particular that have basically made it to escape velocity, really substantial new investments and focus, Evan, it would be India and Vietnam. And in both those relationships, a recognition that the United States being able to work constructively in technology has been deeply attractive to allies and partners and allowed us to provide a value proposition to them that has been unique. So I would say that generally speaking, I know we'll get into the diplomacy directly and the bilateral engagement between the United States and China, which is more important than ever. But we think the surrounding context, the domestic investments, working with allies and partners have allowed us to engage then subsequently with China from a position of strength.
Can I just push you on one piece
Please.
of this? I mean, I know you hear this when you're out in the region, but I mean, a lot of us hear this a lot, which is that the United States is somehow long on security, but shorter on trade-related rulemaking, standard setting, norm driving. And I mention that in particular because of your mention of India. I mean, if I think about the trade landscape in the region, norms and standards now are being set by three agreements: the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. Yeah. And on the outside of not one, not two, but all three of those is the largest economy in the India, and the largest economy across the Pacific, the United States. So no Indo, no Pacific, with the centrality of Asian economies in that.
Yeah.
The conventional answer to that is, well, there's a lot of business, there's a lot of U.S. foreign direct investment, things in technology like digital rulemaking are outside the scope of some of those agreements. Do you worry about that we're too long on security, and particularly for a technology-interested audience? Is that a challenge strategically?
So, look, Evan, I think it's a good point, but actually, I do believe we've diversified our engagements more fundamentally, and defense is a critical component, is our ticket to the big game. But as you rightly point out, last year in many of our bilateral relationships were banner years in trade. We're still the largest investor in most of these countries. I would indicate, even though it does not get as much attention, the IPEF venue that was launched in APEC in San Francisco is an attempt to try to provide some rules of the road for how to think about technology, supply chains, issues associated with critical minerals. I would say, Evan, I think there are other venues that are important as well. There are a number of institutions. I think we've recognized that it is important who leads multilateral organizations in Geneva and elsewhere that are standard settings. We have sought to work more closely with allies and partners on those arrangements. But I think the fundamental question that you're asking, do Asian partners feel satisfied with economic and commercial engagement? And I think it is undeniable that they seek more from the United States. I mean, my hope is that we engage in a constructive dialogue in terms of what's next with respect to trade. And it's clear that the traditional approaches, which are simply about a market opening in the United States, are ill-suited to the complex circumstances that we're dealing with today. So I think it is clear that there needs to be a fundamental dialogue in the United States about the future of trade. And that dialogue seeks to bridge the challenges between both our political parties to find common approaches that link us with respect to commerce in the Indo-Pacific, which is just undeniable. If we are unable to meet that challenge, then I do believe it will hamper some of our abilities to link and work constructively with allies and partners. I'm confident that those conversations about the future of digital issues that are associated with supply chains and critical minerals, those conversations are advancing, and at the center of all of those are strong position and engagement of the United States.
Okay. Let's drill down on China a little bit. To an outside observer, there's been a real flurry of American diplomacy in the last, let's say, 6 to 9 months. The president with Xi Jinping, the Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan with Wang Yi, who's the senior foreign policymaker in China, Secretary Yellen, Secretary Raimondo, the governor of California, the Senate Majority Leader. And if you've been in this business a long time, as both of us have, it felt, I'd say 18 months ago, as if the bottom was kind of dropping out of the relationship. It was in free fall and there was no floor. And from my perspective, at least, it feels like things have stabilized. But even though they've stabilized, it somehow doesn't feel stable, because all of the structural drivers that have made U.S.-China relations unstable in the first place, clashing security concepts, economic and technology tensions, obvious differences of political system and ideology, are still with us. They haven't vanished. So stabilized, but not fundamentally stable. From your perspective, where are we at the end of this flurry of diplomacy? And if, to the extent the relationship isn't really stable, how do we mitigate that to avoid tipping off the cliff?
Well, I had the honor of being with the president when he met with Xi Jinping. I've been in all the bilateral engagements between our two sides at the senior level. I was with Jake Sullivan in Thailand in the follow-up meetings with Wang Yi. I would say what we've sought to do, Evan, is lay out a clear set of priorities to ensure that our lines of communication are open, that we seek mechanisms and capabilities that would deal with instances of inadvertence or miscalculation. I think we are grounded in the reality that the fundamental quality of the U.S.-China relationship is still competitive. And you rightly lay out what are the issues that cause challenges in the relationship that create structural tensions more generally. I do think the Biden administration, we are generally committed to doing what we can to ensure that the competition remains peaceful and does not veer into confrontation. But I would simply say the process of seeking to accomplish that requires intense diplomacy, as Jake Sullivan has articulated. And I think we have made some modest improvements in areas where we work together. We've seen some enhanced cooperation on fentanyl and other issues, still much more work to be done. We have engaged deeply on things like the Middle East. I will say that we have been very clear about our deep and fundamental concerns about China's support for Russia in terms of providing a variety of capabilities, dual use, machine tools, and the like, that has enabled Russia to continue its war of aggression in Ukraine. And we've underscored our concerns there more directly. I think people have to be realistic about what can be achieved or attained in U.S.-China relations. I don't think, Evan, and you're not suggesting this, that we're going to go back to a period in which, the kind of diplomacy we saw in the 90s and the noughts. This is going to be much more challenging. And again, we are structural competitors. I think in many circumstances, dialogue and discussion can help and can perhaps prevent the worst kinds of miscalculation. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the nature of the relationship is going to be challenging, almost inevitably.
Yeah. So when you ask people, when I ask people what's changed in U.S.-China relations, say over the last decade, the usual answer is, well, we've moved from the era that you just described, to an era of strategic competition. But it seems to me strategic competition, in a sense, has always been there between the U.S. and China. What I noticed that's changed, and it's particularly interesting because this is a technology conference in that tech context is what I would call the securitization of a lot of the economic and technology-related flows between the two sides. When I came up in this business, security competition was a feature of the relationship. We always had differences on Taiwan, on the South China Sea. There were clashing security concepts in East Asia and in the Western Pacific. But on a parallel track, there was this enormous flow of goods, capital, people, technology, data that happened alongside that set of security differences. Yeah. So what I notice that's changed is that many of those economic flows are increasingly being refracted on both sides through the prism of national security. And technology is particularly vulnerable to that because so many of the emerging and foundational technologies, including, for instance, AI-enabled applications, are intrinsically dual or multiple use. So is there room still to desecuritize some areas of the US-China relationship, or are we just in an era where a lot of the go-to moves that both sides used to lean on, increasing economic flows, pumping up co-innovation, it's just inconceivable in an era of strategic competition?
So, Evan, it's an important point. I would like to just, I think, at least place this in a larger context. I think in terms of American strategic thinking, much of what was attempted in an earlier period is to refine and to frame issues and work in the context of coexistence. It was a complex coexistence, but really a belief that China would accept the essential features of the global order, that we would work in ways that on technology and economics that would serve the larger good, and that we were working towards a goal of a kind of shared prosperity and again, a global coexistence that suggested certainly the Indo-Pacific was big enough for the both of us. I think what has become clear, though, particularly in the age of Xi Jinping, that I think China has larger ambitions, and I think in many respects they have believed for some time that the United States is in a period of substantial decline, and that in many respects they would like to replace the United States in many venues, and I think distrust many of our strategic objectives and the like. And so if you look back even to the earliest days of when President Xi came to power, he was very clear-eyed about the role that technology would play. And so it's important. Rarely has a leader been so clear and open about objectives. And so in 2012, 2013, 2014, a series of speeches that puts technology at the center of Chinese objectives. And much of his language and objectives are really about domination, supremacy, basically the commanding heights of technology. And so I think the interesting thing is not about, our relationship is competitive, but I think it took a long time for the United States to really fundamentally recognize that China was going about things not as much in a spirit of let's maximize coexistence, but let's seek unilateral advantage. And I think that played out primarily on the technology front. Now, I think the key is, and you've heard Evan, the Secretary and others, President describe small yard, high fence. I would just note that the number of transactions and the kinds of work that is being limited now is a very small component of the overall engagement between the United States and China. The president has been clear that there are certain areas of technology in which he's not prepared, AI chips and the like, to provide them if he believes that they are going to be weaponized and used in ways that could be antithetical to American and allied purposes. And I would stand behind that. I think that is the right approach. The hard thing that you described, though, Evan, the reason that this is so different, for instance, than an earlier period, like the period between the United States and the Soviet Union, we had virtually no interdependence, really no links between our two countries during the Cold War. You rightly point out the situation that we find ourselves in today. There are probably no two countries more interdependent across the board in a variety of ways than the United States and China. Probably no two countries more uncomfortable with elements of that interdependence, and each are seeking to adjust elements of that for national advantage. I personally believe that we outsourced and engaged in a variety of things that created vulnerabilities for the United States, and it will be important for us to diversify lines of communication to ensure that we've got other sources for procurement and provision of critical materials and manufacturing. I believe that will be in our best strategic interests. I do think that this process, by definition, though, Evan, will be complicated. It will not be easy. It will take time figuring out the things that we're deeply comfortable continuing with China, and then finding those things, which I think we've been clear about, that we're concerned by. And Evan, if I might say, that really is just on the technology front. There is also the structural issues in which we have, I think, historically experienced the manifestations of Chinese overcapacity. We saw that in steel and aluminum in 2011, 2012, almost wiped out components of our representative companies in the United States. I think we're facing a similar set of challenges with respect to EV vehicles and other components. And the president's been clear he will not sit by and let American businesses and groups be besieged by overcapacity.
So since you mentioned EVs, I've noticed the Europeans seem to be hardening their views of China on that as well, in parallel to the United States. But at least in the technology area, this goes to a fundamental question of coalition building, and you have a global writ now. It feels like there are a lot of countries around the world that, even though attitudes toward China have hardened, are not quite on the same page as the United States in terms of controlling broader co-innovation with China, controlling certain kinds of technology flows to China, and even on some of the sanctions or restrictions that the U.S. has imposed, it feels like the U.S. is having to coerce compliance rather than get voluntary compliance, even from allies and partners. I mean, I think of something like ASML, right, which makes ultraviolet lithography in the Netherlands. If it were such a no-brainer for ASML, it presumably would have happened years ago in terms of controlling the flow of some of that stuff to China. So do you feel like you're on the right page or on the same page in the first instance with our closest allies and partners on technology controls to China, but then with the broader sweep of, let's say, the global South and other countries? How's the coalition building?
Yeah, so look, there's a lot there, and I'd want to disaggregate a few of those things. Let's leave the global South for a moment, Evan, because I think there are unique and deep challenges there, which are affected by a variety of things, including, increases in prices because of energy and food challenges associated with the war in Ukraine, deep concerns about what's transpiring in Gaza. Those are some of the things that are complicating Western and U.S. standing in the global South. We can get into that. I would say, just at a general level, I would not dismiss how important the convergence is between the United States and Europe around how we think about challenges in the Indo-Pacific. I think that's a substantial accomplishment. Evan, when we first started working on this, sometimes those conversations between the United States and Europe had the Mars-Venus quality, very difficult talking by one another. When I was in my previous job at the White House, in fact, much of my responsibility was not talking to the Indo-Pacific, but talking to Europe about the Indo-Pacific, and also creating those critical linkages between the Indo-Pacific and Europe, which we think are increasingly important and dynamic, and are underscored with how much Indo-Pacific countries have supported in joint efforts like Ukraine. So I want to underscore, I think the dominant feature is not the United States, forcing allies and partners into a worldview that they are hesitant about. It is much more about a joint exploration in which we are finding increasing common ground. I think the issues that you raised on technology are by nature complicated. And there are the natural issues associated with company advantage. Countries are wary of giving up certain advantages and worried about what it means for their position in markets. I would say, generally speaking, on the issues of technology, whether it be on AI frameworks, on semiconductors, on thinking about quantum, increasingly synthetic biology, robotics. I would say, Evan, my experience is that the dominant characterization of those discussions, both with Europe and Asia, is a growing consensus. Yes, in the application, there are always challenges, always companies and countries seeking national advantage. But overall, in terms of working on a common set of goals and ambitions, I would say that the dominant features of those interactions are increasing collaborations, sharing of views and objectives. If I could just say the last thing that I would just point out, what's challenging here is, imagine a national security and foreign policy cohort who for the last 25 years have been largely focused on the Middle East and South Asia, and now suddenly asked to be expert on technology and understand the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. So there's a huge amount of education, exposure to new data that is underway in a variety of governments. And I think what's interesting is not the gaps in that, is how far we've come in a relatively short period.
Great. So we got 2.5 minutes, and I do want to ask you about Taiwan, just because it's the thing that could tip the region into crisis. So we're 12 days away from the inauguration of a new president in Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, and he will give an inaugural speech. And my long experience with Beijing tells me that no matter what he says, they're going to not like it. And I'm wondering just give us a sense of what you expect in the period after May 20th. Are the gloves going to come off? Do you feel like we're in a good place? Have things stabilized? The things the Chinese say about it after the meetings with the U.S., is that just boilerplate? Or do you feel like we're in a better position than we were, let's say, 18 months ago, both on the deterrence side and on the reassurance side?
Thank you, Evan. So look, I would just underscore, we have had intense diplomacy on every element of the situation across the Taiwan Straits. Intense dialogue and diplomacy with allies and partners, unofficial interactions with Taiwan, and also, I think, important diplomacy with key interlocutors in Beijing. I think our overall set of goals and objectives remain unchanged. We support peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We continue to play an active, dynamic role in the Western Pacific. We discourage provocative steps that would alter the status quo in ways that could be dangerous or unpredictable. And we believe fundamentally that it is in the best interests of all parties to maintain dialogue and to work in constructive ways. I really can't predict the future. I do want to just underscore that we remain deeply engaged, and I think we have, in all of our conversations, underscored that our position has not changed, and we believe that the last 30 or 40 years have been among the best for the peoples of Taiwan and China, and the maintenance of the status quo, we believe, in the current environment serves both their best interests.
Great. Well, Kurt, we know you have a lot on your plate. You've got a global writ now as Deputy Secretary. We thank you for carving out a little bit of time for us, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you, Evan, very much. Great to be with you.
Thanks.